Greetings. Welcome to PCAP's annual Praise Got the Goods Week. This week features a webinar series about ecological goods and services provided by the native prairies ecosystem. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Dr. Edward Bork will be speaking about how grazing boosts grassland carbon storage, an undervalued ecosystem service. Before we begin, I'd like to state that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Just a few items before we get going. I'd like to note our final Prairie's Got the Goods Week webinar will be tomorrow at 12 p.m. And Dr. Branimir Jetvai will be speaking about biodiversity conservation and food security. And if you've been enjoying our webinars, then check out our Native Prairie speaker series. We have one about pronghorn coming up in the near future. And just a reminder to all of our listeners, if you have questions during the webinar, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, and we'll be answering questions at the end. Feel free to upvote other people's questions if you have the same one. Because we have quite a few people on, everyone will be muted for the duration of the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to thank our financial support by our presenting sponsor, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association. And our supporting sponsors are North American Helium, Nutri, and SaskTown. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter. Dr. Edward Bork is the Matthias Chair in Rangeland Ecology and Management and Director of the Rangeland Research Institute at the University of Alberta. He has been teaching and conducting research for more than 25 years on basic and applied topics, including integrated weed control, grazing systems, fire ecology, forage production, agroforestry, and recently the role of rangelands in providing alternative ecosystem goods and services, including carbon storage, greenhouse gas reduction, and biodiversity retention. He has supervised 48 graduate students, including 11 PhD students. Dr. Bork maintains close ties with the agriculture industry and has given numerous extension talks. So with that, I will pass it over.
Thank you, Caitlin. Get this all set up. There we go. That looks good.
Yes, perfect.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin, for the intro, and thank you for the invite to come and speak today. So I'm going to be talking to you about some of the work that we've been doing on grassland carbon, grassland greenhouse gas mitigation. This work started back in roughly 2012, and so has been somewhere around 10 to 12 years in the process. And there's a small army of people that have been working on this. Along with myself, there's been a number of researchers from the Ag Food Nutritional Science Department, the Renewable Resources Department, also folks over in Biological Sciences. And then we've had close collaboration from the Alberta Environment, the Range Branch, folks led by Mike Alexander and others that have participated, and then a small army of graduate students and summer students. So I just want to start by acknowledging that this is very much a team effort that we've been doing. I have given this talk a number of times, including at this particular venue about 4 or 5 years ago. And so I'm hoping that I will have incorporated some of the newer results that we've had. So this will be kind of a rolling update on the work that we've found, some of the highlights, but also where we're at right now. So just to review, the overarching research program objectives that we've had since when we started the program back in 2012 is really, first and foremost, to quantify the size and stability of the carbon stores across what we have in Western Canada, which is the northern temperate grasslands, characterized by a lot of cool season species. But we also wanted to look at where that carbon is stored. So how much of it is above ground in the live vegetation, how much of it is below ground in the roots, how much of it is in soil, organic matter, and so on. And one of the interesting findings is how much litter or how much carbon do we have in maybe the dead components, so the litter and mulch components, which turned out to be a very important component. And then over and above looking at just the amount of carbon is also determining how grazing as a predominant land use practice, how does it affect the carbon? Does it increase it? Does it decrease carbon? And also understanding where and when these changes occur, with an eye on trying to understand or develop a predictive framework so that if we can predict where, when, and how grazing might increase soil carbon, that would allow landowners to develop more prescribed tools, if you like, to alter their grazing regime so that they can boost that ecosystem service with an understanding that the goal here is to provide an empirical foundation, so quantitative data that supports a policy framework to reward ranchers and grass farmers for carbon storage, for maintaining carbon and increasing carbon. So the studies that we've undertaken, I've loosely lumped them into three broad groups. The first one is an Alberta study looking at the amount of carbon that is stored in soil and vegetation across more than 100 locations in Alberta. These were paired up with the Alberta benchmarking program from Alberta Environment and Parks. This is basically an exclosure program. And this allowed us to compare grazed and non-grazed grasslands. And that was done between 2012 and 2015. We also came into possession of an additional data set from Saskatchewan. This was from the former PFRA pastures in Saskatchewan. Those data were obtained in 2013, and then we spent some time basically looking at the relationship between soil carbon stocks and plant community attributes, as well as grazing history. And the grazing history was a very unique component of that particular data set because we had specific stocking rate data over many, many years, in fact, a couple decades for those pastures. And the third study is a study that wrapped up not too long ago on the role of adaptive multi-paddock. So this is a type of rotational grazing involving fairly high stock density cattle grazing, where we looked at grassland functional responses. So we looked at everything from vegetation responses to water infiltration, greenhouse gas fluxes, soil microbes, and soil carbon. So I'll be touching on the highlights in that study as well. So I want to go all the way back to the beginning and just start out by talking about how much carbon do these systems actually contain. So across those more than 100 grasslands in Alberta, where we were able to quantify the carbon stock, we found that, of course, there's a very broad range of carbon. If we go to the drier regions in the mixed grass prairie in southeastern Alberta, we found somewhere around 50 to 60 tons of carbon per hectare. But when we go to the higher rainfall, more mesic grasslands in southwestern Alberta, we're seeing much larger levels than that, upwards of 3 times or even higher than that. So in the foothill and montane regions, we were seeing 150 to 180 tons of carbon per hectare or even higher. And these are relatively conservative estimates because we did not, in that particular study, in the benchmarking study, we didn't quantify the deep soil carbon. So we only looked at the soil carbon down to 30 centimeters, simply because these were long-term research areas, the rangeland reference areas. So we weren't allowed to take a soil coring truck in and go down deeper than 30 centimeters. So these are conservative estimates of soil carbon, but it just shows the magnitude of the amount of carbon that is stored there. And on average, if we pool it across all of the grasslands in Alberta, we were seeing over 90 tons per hectare of carbon. Another interesting thing, that if you look at the graph on the right here, we were able to compare at a number of locations the amount of carbon that was stored in our native grasslands. So native grasslands, meaning grasslands that had never been cultivated before. And they were generally somewhere around 30 to 40% higher in carbon stock than both croplands, so areas that were under some kind of annual cropping system, or introduced forages. So these might have been areas that were in cropland in the past, but then were seeded down to some kind of forage mix, for example, brome, alfalfa, or something like that. Most of the soil carbon that we found was the soil organic carbon, which is denoted here basically by the black bar. However, a couple of pools that I want to touch on. One of them is that our native grasslands actually had a very significant amount of carbon in what we call the mulch layer. So the mulch layer is a layer of variable decomposing organic material found on the surface of the soil. And it usually represents the biomass that's transitioning from live plant material that once it dies, it's in various stages of decomposition. We actually found that that pool of carbon, excuse me, within the mix or within these grasslands was upwards of 15 tons of carbon per hectare, which is quite a large pool of carbon when you think about it. Okay, how do these studies compare with a lot of other results? Well, some of these questions, for example, the land use conversion question has been tested globally by many folks in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, and other locations. And one thing that is very consistent is that where we see a transition, sorry, folks, where we see a transition from perennial grassland over into some kind of cultivated cropland, we almost universally see a decline in soil carbon of anywhere from 30 to 50%. For example, these two examples here, the one on the lower left, is an example from studies that were done at the Staveley Research Station where they converted native grassland into either perennial forages or continuous cropping. In the case of the perennial forages, we generally saw about a 20% decline in soil carbon concentration. And in the case of the continuous wheat cropping system, we saw a decline of about 30%. A similar study conducted down at the 1-4 Research Station showed a similar decline with about a third reduction in the areas that have been converted from native grassland into tame, so planted pasture, and about a 40% decline under continuous reproduction. And so this just reinforces the fact that if we take these perennial grassland systems and we plow them under and we convert them to either annual cropland or we convert them even into tame introduced species, we generally see quite a large reduction in soil carbon storage. Okay, at these same benchmarking locations where we had the opportunity to compare the amount of carbon inside the exclosures with outside, we actually documented a net increase of somewhere around 12% in soil carbon stock associated with the exposure to long-term grazing. And this increase occurred in all areas with the exception of the dry mixed grass. So this increase was observed, for example, in the Aspen Parkland. It was observed in the foothills fescue, it was observed in the montane grasslands of southwestern Alberta, and also the upper foothill grasslands, which are the moistest or highest rainfall grasslands. The largest increase was evident in the 0 to 15 centimeter zone, so basically the top 6 inches of soil. And so again, this is providing some very compelling evidence that the most prevalent land use that we have of these grasslands, which is livestock grazing, is actually compatible with maintaining and potentially even increasing soil carbon stock. And so this is a good news story. And this raised the question for us of why and how does grazing increase soil carbon? Because if we want to use grazing as a prescriptive tool to try to increase soil carbon stock, we need to understand how and why this occurs. So again, I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights of what we've observed. But one of the things that consistently occurs in grasslands that are continuing to be exposed to low to moderate cattle grazing, what we tend to see is typically an increase in plant community diversity. So it means there's a greater variety of plant species occupying these areas. And this is, once again, pretty consistent. You see the different subregions in the graph here on the right side, ranging from the dry mixed grass prairie all the way over to the upper foothills. We pretty consistently see this net increase in plant species, with the largest increase being associated with the central parkland and the foothills fescue regions. Now, why does this diversity increase? Well, just to be clear, a lot of the diversity increase was due to an increase in broadleaf dicots. So these are the flowering plants, basically, as you see in the upper photo here. And a lot of those happen to be grazing tolerant exotics. So it includes species like dandelion and broadleaf plantain and white clover and alside clover and a lot of these other different species that are quite grazing tolerant and are contributing to the overall increase in the species pool. And so plant diversity increases may actually help explain soil carbon stocks. And I'll show you some data later on in this presentation that tends to support that argument. Okay, to answer this question about where and how grazing actually alters soil carbon stock, we conducted what's called a structural equation model. And this is the result of that model. I know it looks really, really complicated, but I'm going to try to simplify it down. What we're ultimately interested in increasing is the soil organic carbon stock, which is over on the far right side of this diagram. And grazing, which is the treatment we were specifically looking at within our benchmarking study, because we had grasslands that were both grazed and long-term protected or ungrazed, we were able to relate the effect of either grazing presence or grazing exclusion, so no grazing, on soil organic carbon stock. And the way we did that is by looking at the biomass contribution of both graminoids, so our grasses, and our broadleaf dicots, so the forb biomass, as well as the quality of those plants. And by quality, the metric that we utilized was the carbon to nitrogen ratio, because carbon to nitrogen ratio is an important determinant of how readily something can be potentially broken down, for example, by microbes. And the net result of that analysis indicated that when we link grazing to soil organic carbon, there were two paths. So two mechanisms by which grazing influenced soil organic carbon. In the first path, grazing increased forb biomass. And so that's part of that boost in plant diversity that I just referred to. And that in turn led to increases in litter carbon, so the dead and decomposing material on the soil surface. And that in turn increased soil organic carbon. And we see that path right here is denoted over to forb biomass, litter carbon mass, and then a positive relationship with soil organic carbon. So grazing induces more dicots or broadleaf plants, that diversity increase, which increases litter, that increases soil organic carbon. The second one is an influence on the quality of the vegetation produced. But interestingly enough, that pathway did not run through the wildflowers. It didn't run through the broadleaf dicots. That path actually explicitly ran through the grass quality. And so the mechanism here is a little bit different in that grazing reduced the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it made more nitrogen, the litter basically more nitrogen rich. And that in turn increased litter carbon mass. So that's that path going down to a reduction in graminoid carbon to nitrogen, which led to an increase in litter carbon mass, and that in turn directly increased soil organic carbon. The net result is that grazing contributed to a soil organic carbon increase due to these two routes. One, the increase in the diversity and the presence of wildflowers, in essence, the broadleaf dicots, as well as this increase in quality as reflected by a reduction in carbon to nitrogen ratio of the graminoids. Graminoid biomass was actually independent of the relationship between grazing and soil organic carbon. So it's not the amount of grasses, it's the quality of that grass biomass that contributes to soil organic carbon accumulation. Okay, I mentioned that we observed this potential positive relationship of grassland carbon responses to introduced plants, the exotics. And we actually observed this in several instances, and this is the first one. So in the Alberta study, when we looked at the relationship between soil carbon in the topsoil, the top 6 inches of soil, and the proportion of introduced diversity, that's on the x-axis here, regardless of whether these communities were exposed to long-term chronic grazing or not, in general, a greater proportion of introduced diversity actually led to an increase in soil carbon in the topsoil, in that top 6 inches of soil. And this response was independent of grazing. So those plants were triggering an increase in carbon regardless of whether there was a grazing-related effect or not. So just their presence is increasing soil carbon. And then in the data set that we obtained from Saskatchewan, we actually observed very, very similar results, where soil carbon mass generally increased in the upper 15 centimeters of soil. So again, this is the top 6 inches of soil. And we also observed this in relation to an increasing stocking rate. And these stocking rates were normalized for rainfall, which means we basically tried to neutralize the effect of rainfall. So the map on the right side across Saskatchewan shows the various PFRA community pastures where we had soil carbon data. And so when we looked at that, and we looked specifically at the influence of the long-term aggregate stocking rate across these grasslands, we noticed this very distinct relationship that the carbon content in the top 6 inches of soil was increasing with stocking rate. Again, raising an interesting question, why? Well, when we dig deeper into the Saskatchewan data, what we found is that the carbon increases in Saskatchewan were very closely tied to the abundance of Kentucky bluegrass, so Poa pratensis. This is a very common grass that is widely naturalized across much of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. There's also a native form of Poa pratensis, interestingly enough, but the predominant form that we find is really this naturalized, introduced species. And inevitably, the areas that had accumulated more carbon under greater stocking were much more dominated by the prevalence of this Kentucky bluegrass. Similar results have actually been reported in North Dakota, in grasslands not that dissimilar from the ones that we were studying in Saskatchewan. And it really does reinforce this likelihood that species like bluegrass that tend to be very productive, producing a lot of biomass, are actually adding not only plant diversity, but because of their high biomass production, that they're adding carbon through photosynthesis and the capture of energy and conversion into biomass. Okay, we have also done some studies looking at grazing-induced changes to nutrient cycling. The reason why we're interested in this because livestock are fundamentally nutrient cyclers. They accelerate nutrient cycling by consuming material, digesting material, and returning those nutrients to the soil in a very different form. And that also, that the presence of grazing actually may change the microclimate on the soil surface. So when we think about things like the relative humidity, the temperature, the moisture levels, or even through trampling by pushing debris and material into the soil surface where it may be more prone to biological decay. When we looked at the litter decay curves, and these were from focal studies done both in the foothills fescue and in the aspen parkland, what we actually observed is that litter that was situated on the soil surface within these grazed communities actually did indeed break down faster. So the rate of turnover of that material as it goes through from the live plant community pool through the litter pool and then into the various forms of a decomposing material, that breakdown actually occurred much more rapidly under the presence of grazing. Now, whether it's due to trampling or whether it's due to the change in microclimate, all of these things are potential factors. But another thing we did is we actually looked at the specific decomposability of different grass species, keeping in mind that what we are seeing under grazing is this shift in community composition towards maybe an increased abundance of plants like Kentucky bluegrass that are fairly grazing tolerant. And indeed, we found significant differences among the decomposability, so the turnover rates of those individual grasses. So the graph in the lower left here shows 4 different plant species. 3 of them are native grasses. This is a comparison of western wheatgrass, foothills rough fescue, June grass, but also Kentucky bluegrass. And among the 4 of them, Kentucky bluegrass actually had the highest rate of decomposition. And again, likely attributable to potentially this increase in quality as reflected by a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio within that particular plant species. So grazing is having this collective effect in changing a lot of different conditions, including the quality and the decomposability of biomass and this change in plant diversity. Okay, so following that initial work, we followed that up with work on adaptive multi-paddock grazing systems. So across Canada, about anywhere between half and all the way up to 3/4 of our livestock producers are using some kind of rotational grazing, which basically means that they're rotating their animals from one paddock to another, giving some form of rest to one area at any one point in time. However, less than 10% of cattle producers are using AMP grazing, which is this adaptive multi-paddock. So adaptive multi-paddock is a specialized form of rotational grazing because it involves the creation of many, many smaller paddocks and then the use of much higher stock densities, where the goal is to get much more uniform forage use and then also allow for a long recovery period between successive grazing events. So animals move into a paddock for a short period of time, you get relatively uniform utilization, then they move on to another paddock, and in the process, because there's so many paddocks, that provides for a relatively long rest period. So we conducted this work at a number of different sites. This was on-farm work conducted in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. We had 32 different ranch pairs. We had a broad range of soil and climatic zones. So we had producers in the parkland, the mixed grass prairie, the foothills, and also the lower boreal. And then we evaluated all kinds of different factors. The management activity that was going on, forage production and utilization, water infiltration, carbon dynamics, and microbial properties. So I'm going to touch on all of these, but only very briefly in the time that I've left. So the way to think about this is at each one of these locations, so at each one of these red dots that you see here distributed across Western Canada, we basically had a paired study design where we sampled the grassland soils associated with a known adaptive multi-paddock grazer. And these grazers were associated with basically a progressive system of dividing the landscape up into many smaller paddocks and then moving their animals, as you can see here. And these were then compared to a neighbor. And the neighbor might have been continuously grazing, as you see here, where animals had free range access to the entire grazable area for the whole summer, or they might have been a slow rotational grazer. So we didn't typically have control over who the neighbor was, but the way I like to think of it is the neighbors are a random sample of conventional grazing practices. So the industry at large, if you like. And this allowed us to then look at the specific effect of different treatment effects, things like stocking rate, stock density, or rest periods on subsequent responses. So I'm going to break the results here up into a series of questions. So the first question is, what are the inherent management differences between the AMP and the neighbors? And keeping in mind the neighbors are this random sample of conventional beef operators operating across the prairie provinces. So bottom line here is that AMP ranchers fundamentally differed in how they grazed, but not necessarily how much they grazed. And what I mean by that is that if we look at the actual stocking rates, so stocking rates are typically measured through something like animal unit months per hectare. So that's a function of how many animals, but also how long they graze for, because the longer they grazed for, the higher the accumulated forage use. So when we looked at the actual stocking rates, statistically, there was no difference between the AMP operators and the neighbors. But what did very much differ is how they grazed. For example, the use of stock density, which is the number of animals per unit area based on the average pasture size and the herd size, they were generally 20-fold higher on the AMP ranches. So it means that the AMP ranchers were typically trying to use these high stock densities to get uniform use of the vegetation, and then and also by moving their animals fairly quickly, provide for a lengthy rest period. A couple other interesting things that popped out is that the AMP ranchers typically grazed earlier and longer. For example, you can see that the AMP ranchers had an average starting date of around April 25th, whereas a lot of our conventional grazers were starting grazing in the latter half of May, somewhere around May 17th. And when we looked at the complete length of the total grazing season, that the AMP producers were grazing a little over 7 months in duration, while a lot of the conventional grazers were around only 4.5 months. So a big difference in stretching out the grazing season, and AMP ranchers were starting earlier, ending later, and having a longer grazing season. And of course, that's important when you think about reducing the cost of production, for example. And another really important management difference is the strategic use of pasture rest. So the way we did this, we basically, through the surveys, we were able to quantify basically the average length of a typical grazing period within a pasture, and then the minimum number of days of rest before regrazing would occur. And what we found is a very distinct difference in a metric that this is a new metric to our knowledge. This is called the rest to grazing ratio. RGR is basically the minimum number of days of rest that a pasture will experience after early season defoliation, and we defined that as any grazing that occurred prior to August 1st, which is basically during the early and middle part of the growing season, the period during which the pastures are generally more sensitive to potential damage because they're more actively growing during that time. So it's a minimum days of rest after early season defoliation prior to regrazing. And when we looked at the distribution of this data, what we quickly figured out is the AMP producers generally allowed at least 40 days of rest for each day of early season grazing. And even, some of the other AMP operators, they were generally had at least 6 days of rest per day of grazing. So it means if even at a value of 6, if a producer grazed for 4 days, they allowed for at least 24 or 25 days of rest prior to regrazing. However, the conventional grazers were definitely on the other end of the spectrum, where they either had no rest, which is represented by a rest to grazing ratio of less than 2, and the vast majority of them were either 0 to 2 or even less than 6. So clearly there's pronounced differences in how grazing is being applied to these pastures, and that could well be important in explaining some of the differences. Okay, another question that often came up is, how does AMP grazing alter grassland production and forage use? And this was done by a PhD student who has since finished. This was Jessica Grenke's work. And again, just some highlights of the work that she's actually done. It's really interesting that the AMP grazed pastures exhibited greater overall grassland biomass production. So the forage yields were actually higher. And when we compare between the AMP pastures, they were generally producing over 3,000 kilograms per hectare, as opposed to the neighboring operations, which again are this conventional grab bag of random ranchers. They were producing around 2,500 kilograms per hectare. And this is measured right around peak growth in midsummer. And what was even more astounding is that these higher levels of production, the 3,000 under AMP grazing, occurred despite a greater level of average utilization. In looking at the average utilization, the AMP ranchers had an average level of 38% forage utilization by midsummer, as opposed to 15% utilization in the neighboring ranches, which is unusual because it actually suggests that if you apply AMP grazing, that producers could actually produce their grass or have their grass and consume it too, through the strategic use of grazing under this very unique defoliation regime. Okay, the third question that I want to touch on is, how does AMP grazing alter water infiltration? Of course, the conservation of water and the use of water, so water use efficiency is very important, particularly in years like the one we just came through in 2023, where drought was widespread across much of the prairie provinces, including here in Alberta. This work was headed up by Dr. Tim Daubert. He was a postdoc at the time, and it's been published. So again, a very interesting and compelling result is that AMP grazed soils took up more water when we did our infiltrometer tests. In fact, when we compared the rates of water infiltration, the conventionally grazed neighbors were somewhere around 60 millimeters of water infiltration per hour, whereas the AMP multi-paddock grazed soils were taking up close to 100 millimeters per water. Why is this important? Well, if you think about a large rainfall event, if you have a soil that can take up more of that water faster, it means that more of that water is going to go into the soil profile and be made available for plant growth. If the soil can't take that water up, it's going to simply it's going to run off and be lost and not be made available. So water infiltration is one of those metrics that we're definitely very interested in trying to maintain in order to capture as much water and make sure it's not lost. Okay, the fourth question, does AMP grazing alter greenhouse gas emissions? This was work through a combination of work by Bharat Shrestha and Zilong Ma. This has been published in a couple of different papers. So again, I'll just touch on some highlights here. So when we looked at the greenhouse gas dynamics from the pastures themselves, this is in the field, we found that the CO2 fluxes, so that the amount of carbon dioxide that was being released from the soil, increased with total cattle stocking rates, and you can see that right here. And this was particularly apparent in the moister grasslands, the more productive grasslands. So those would be the ones that are kind of in north central Saskatchewan, north central Alberta, the ones in Manitoba, or the eastern slopes of Alberta, so southwestern Alberta. But this is a function of the cattle stocking rates itself. And so that's suggesting that if you have too much grazing, that's really compromising the health of the soil microbes and the ability of the soil to maintain a positive net carbon dynamic. And so then those grassland soils become a net source for carbon. The other thing that we noticed is that the methane uptake, and a lot of people are surprised that soils can actually be a net sink for carbon, and they can, because there are microbes in the soil that are basically methanotrophs, so they consume methane. They use methane as a substrate in their biochemical processes. And methane uptake was actually greater in grasslands lacking prior cultivation. So that's shown by this graph over here. The cultivated, so soils or grasslands that had a history of cultivation here are shown on the right side. The ones that had a history of never being cultivated are shown on the left side. And the negative numbers here are the carbon flux. A negative is a good thing because it means that there's more methane being removed from the atmosphere than is being emitted. If you had a positive methane flux, it would mean that the soil is releasing more methane than it's taking up. So both of our treatments actually were a net sink for methane. However, the ones that had never been cultivated in the past had a much stronger sink for methane flux, which means there was a higher activity of methanotrophs removing more methane. Why is that a good thing? Well, cattle are often vilified for being methane producers because of their enteric fermentation, but it means that a well-managed perennial grassland, particularly if it's never been cultivated, that these areas can help offset enteric methane emissions through methanotrophic activity in the soil. We also did some lab incubations. So the way I like to think of this, we took soil from the field, from our AMP ranches and from the neighboring ranches. We brought it into the lab, and then we looked at this specific methane dynamics in relation to different temperatures and moisture conditions. And again, a negative value here is a good thing because it means greater methane consumption. And once again, within those conditions, we actually observed a greater sink, so greater uptake of methane within the soil that had been primed under AMP grazing. So the way I like to think about this is that the grazing treatment in the field would have created a specific microbial community, and we're then seeing the effect of that in the lab incubation. And also, when we looked at the role of soil temperature, if you have really warm soils, the sink strength actually reached a maximum. Why is this important? Well, think about 2021 when we had record heat waves sweeping across much of the prairie provinces. And of course, with climate change, we suspect that there's going to be further heat wave events. And so that means that for whatever reason, the AMP prime soils have microbial communities that seem to be superior in terms of the amount of methane they're able to remove from the atmosphere. So again, this is a good news story. I'm going to talk a little bit about the soil microbes, even though I'm not a microbiologist. So if you have specific questions, I'll probably redirect some of your questions. But Dr. Opama, KC, did the work on characterizing the microbes within the soil of our ranches. And we observed a number of interesting things. For example, the AMP grazed soils had very much a different soil microbial community. This includes reducing the microbial biomass carbon to nitrogen ratios, also decreasing the fungal to bacterial ratios. And what this suggests is that AMP grazed soils may be experiencing more rapid biogeochemical cycling, so turnover of nutrients, which would be consistent with some of the work that we found earlier on the rates of litter decomposition. We also saw differences in the diversity of fungi and bacteria. So the AMP grazed soils, ironically, were higher in fungal diversity, but had lower bacterial diversity. And so this raises an interesting question of, could the identity of the microbes be more important than their abundance in regulating carbon dynamics, so carbon turnover and ultimately carbon storage? And again, I'll put one interesting result. This is from some of Upama's work that is just coming out right now. This is a microbial community network analysis. And the bottom line is what this analysis does, it looks for interrelationships among the different soil microbial components. So not only between the bacteria and the fungi, but also between the different groupings of bacteria and between the different groupings of fungi. And the bottom line is this, that the AMP grazed soils led to increased complexity of the microbial network. So if you think about what's below ground is this complex ecosystem of soil microbes that are working with one another. The AMP grazed grasslands essentially had a more complex microbial community. And that may be indicative of enhanced, for example, cooperation, if you like, among the different soil taxa that are looking at carbon and nitrogen cycling. We also found higher cattle stocking rates also increased network complexity, although I'm not showing that here. So again, what we're doing above ground with our large herbivores is having an impact below ground on many different properties, including the composition and complexity and diversity of the microbial community. Okay, so the last question I want to touch on is, how does AMP grazing alter soil carbon? And if so, how does it? Does it go up or down? The reason why we're so interested in this is because when you look globally, many studies have looked at this question, but there's no real strong consensus. Some studies suggest that grazing increases carbon, some suggest it goes down. I already showed you results from Alberta and Saskatchewan, at least in the previous work that we've done, suggests that carbon may actually go up in relation to long-term grazing exposure. So, but this is in this controlled study specifically looking at AMP or adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Bottom line is, this is from Lau Sobrino's master's work. He defended this recently. So what we did find is that there was a grazing by stocking rate interaction. So remember that grazing is the grazing treatment. So whether it's adaptive multi-paddock or conventional grazing, and the stocking rate is the amount of grazing, so the intensity of grazing. And what we found is that adaptive multi-paddock grazed soils actually had a thicker AH horizon. So the AH horizon is that surface layer of the mineral soil in which it accumulates all of that rich humic material, all of the dead and decomposing organic matter that basically when we're tilling our garden and we're trying to have a real productive vegetable crop, it's that nice black layer. And that's the heart and soul of your carbon and nitrogen dynamics are happening in there. And that thicker AH horizon led to an increase in soil organic carbon mass. So the left graph here shows the AH depth, so the depth of that AH horizon. And the graph on the right here shows the soil organic carbon mass. However, there is a dependency here on stocking rate, which is that the largest beneficial effect of AMP grazing only occurred at higher stocking rates. So it isn't until you get to higher stocking rates where this very specific pattern of grazing, the adaptive multi-paddock, tended to lead to this thicker AH horizon, which led to more soil organic carbon mass. So we're still trying to understand why that might be the case. Is it because of favoring a lot of grazing tolerant plants that have shallower roots that build up a lot more carbon in the topsoil? We're not too sure on it, but there's a number of different avenues. But I do want to point out once again, within the AMP study, we found the same pattern that soil organic carbon levels once again increased as the proportional abundance of non-native plant species increased. So once again, if we have more introduced grazing tolerant plants, species like Kentucky bluegrass, maybe smooth brome, timothy, and lots of different species fall into this category. that we tend to see this positive increase in soil organic carbon. And this happened regardless of whether we were looking at the AMP or the neighboring, so the conventionally grazed areas. So, and this also happened despite the fact that we generally see a decline in species richness, which is maybe a little bit disturbing for those of you that might be wondering, well, aren't we really concerned about maintaining high species diversity? Yes, species diversity can be important for many reasons, including maintaining forage yields and drought resistance and all those kinds of things. But by and large, AMP grazing led to a simpler, so less species-rich community that had more grazing-tolerant plants, often many of them introduced, and those appear to elevate soil carbon, likely through their high biomass production, high inputs of root mass, especially in the topsoil, potentially their unique chemistry, their lower carbon to nitrogen ratios, and their rapid nutrient turnover, as we saw in the rates of litter decomposition. We also did, this is a separate study, but I think it's worth mentioning. Some of you may have heard this notion that pulsed grazing leads to a specific change in carbon dynamics within the plants in terms of how much carbon is moved into the soil. There isn't a lot of empirical data out there to back this up. And so this was a study that was done by Scott Chang and some others. It basically where there was pulse defoliation and then using carbon-13 as an isotopic tracer, they were able to look at how much of the carbon was moved from above ground, from the shoot biomass down into the subsoil. And what's interesting is that 21% of the carbon that was fixed was found in the mineral soil within 24 hours. So that's how quickly the carbon moves from the shoot mass following photosynthesis above ground. It's moved very quickly down into the not only the roots, but also shows up as root exudates. And so when you think about this carbon pathway, the fact that the carbon that's being fixed above ground into sugars moves below ground into the roots, and then there's these root exudates, that's what's essentially feeding your bacteria and your fungi, which is a very large reservoir of potential carbon. And then when those microbes die, it turns into necromass, which is dead microbes, essentially, that forms a really important protected form of carbon in the soil. Grasslands subject to more intense defoliation, like we might find under these intense controlled pulses of AMP grazing, had more carbon allocated to roots within 25 days. So when we imposed these pulses of defoliation and looked at where does the carbon end up, the plants that were defoliated heavier, but then had this lengthy rest time, had more of that carbon show up in the roots at a later date. So that's suggesting that what we do above ground definitely does change the carbon dynamics below ground, both to the roots, but also to the root exudates, to the material that's potentially feeding our soil microbes. So these AMP systems, these pulse defoliation events, definitely do appear to stimulate carbon allocation to the roots and to soil microbes through the root exudate pathway. Okay, so how does this compare to global trends? Well, our general trend for greater soil organic carbon undergrazing is consistent with many other studies that show that grazing boosts soil carbon, and I'm listing a few of them here. There's ones by Mosier, Mastre, and Burney. However, it also contradicts some other studies. For example, there's a meta-analysis by Bai and Cotrufro that showed up in Science just a few years ago, which suggested that for the most part, that the net effect of grazing is most often negative. The thing that I would point out with a lot of our grazing, including in our benchmarking study, including in the PFRA study from Saskatchewan, by and large, we were generally looking at light to moderate stocking rates. And so if there is a net increase in soil carbon under grazing, it's almost always associated with light to moderate grazing. Almost never is it associated with heavy or very heavy levels of grazing. So stocking rate, how much we graze, is always more important than how we graze, just to put it into context. Okay, I want to finish up with what I think is a really important question, which is what's the economic valuation of carbon accrual due to grazing? And so these are results that were published last year. And so for this, I'm going to go back to our benchmarking data. So remember, we had more than 100 sites, and we had this large data set where we were comparing the carbon stocks inside and outside of these exclosures. And we worked with the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, which has this land use footprint data. And we were able to do basically a geospatial analysis, but we used our field data as a predictive framework for understanding how grazing might have affected the carbon stocks across all of these grasslands. So here's the bottom line. Across Alberta, roughly 3.8 million hectares of grassland contain more than 360 million tons of carbon. Okay, now this is a conservative estimate because remember, we didn't go very deep. We didn't capture the deep soil carbon. So this is everything from 30 centimeters into the soil and up. So with all due respect, it is a conservative estimate of the pool of carbon. And then when we merged our field data with the ABMI land use footprint data, it basically showed that grazing on more than 95% of these lands, since it is the predominant land use out there, it has increased carbon stock by more than 17 million tons relative to non-grazed area. And this graph over here shows the distribution, with most of the increase is actually in the parkland, followed by the foothills fescue. Why is that? Well, it's a combination of how much grassland is actually out there that's being grazed. Some areas, there's very little grassland, for example, the upper foothills, and so that pool is relatively small. But what's really telling is when we attach a dollar value to it. So the federal government has told us what the value of carbon is. And so when we published our paper, we used a $50 per ton CO2 equivalence. Right now, we're actually at $65. So these numbers are actually an underestimate based on where carbon is today. And as of April 1st, the carbon value is going to jump to $80 a ton. So then these numbers are going to get even bigger. But just using the $50 per ton of CO2 equivalents, so that's the 2022 valuation, this carbon is worth $3.1 billion. So it means that having the land use of grazing on 95% of this land in Alberta, when we model this out, we've accrued 17 million tons of extra carbon, which is worth roughly $3.1 million. Now, again, where is most of that valuation? It's in the parkland, but that's because that's where the largest increase in soil carbon occurs, but it's also because there's a fair bit of grassland remaining in those areas. The lone zone where we don't see a very large increase in valuation is the dry mixed grass, despite the fact that this is a very large land use type in Alberta. And it's because out of all of the natural subregions that we looked at, the only one that really didn't increase soil carbon stock a lot was the dry mixed grass. There was a very small, basically minuscule increase in soil carbon, but all the other zones demonstrated a sizable increase. The caveat I'll point out once again is that the stocking rates on all of this land are light to moderate. It's not heavy or very heavy. So it's important to put that into context. Okay, summary. So hopefully I've been able to convince you that grasslands are a very important land use, but the land use itself, the grasslands store a very large amount of biological carbon that is currently an undervalued ecosystem service by society. Grazing alters grassland plant composition and nutrient cycling in many different ways. We talked about the increase in plant diversity. We talked about the increase in the alteration to nutrient cycling and decomposition, the transfer of carbon below ground that's feeding the microbes through root exudates. So there's lots of different impacts that are going on. And in many cases, it actually bolsters ecosystem carbon. In fact, most of the situations that we actually looked at. And where we use these specialized grazing systems of adaptive multi-paddock rotational grazing, they might actually be able to enhance plant growth and further increase soil carbon stocks. And so at some point, we're going to have to get a lot more serious about implementing policy changes, either from the top down or bottom up. Bottom up is usually consumer-driven willingness to pay, which is certainly going on already with people that are willing to pay a premium for grass-finished beef. But in all likelihood, we need a top-down policy change as well that properly values this grassland carbon and puts an incentive in place for ranchers to maintain and improve these stocks further. So with that, I just want to thank the many ranchers that we worked with in the AMP study and the staff from the government of Alberta, the range management branch, who let us sample their more than 100 rangeland reference areas in the province, and point out that a lot of folks and a lot of different funding agencies have contributed to this work, including the Ag Canada Greenhouse Gas Program, Alberta Beef Producers, the Alberta Livestock and Meat Agency, and Canadian Ag Partnership, among others. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the really detailed and informative presentation. We, as you can imagine, have lots of questions already from our listeners. The first one, are there differences in the definition of native grassland and pasture land?
That's a really, really good question. So, okay, you're going to get different definitions based on. So here's my perspective. There are pristine native grasslands that still remain, but many of our native systems, and the way we defined it, just to be very, very clear, we defined something that was native as land that had never been cultivated in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So it was still relatively representative of at least a proportion of which was comprised of native vegetation.
Okay.
But the reality is, if you look, for example, at the parkland or even our foothill environments here in Alberta, and even the more mesic areas of the mixed grass prairie, you will inevitably find a very significant footprint of introduced plant species. So there are a lot of naturalized species, so non-native exotic species that have moved into those communities and are now cohabitating with the natives. Excuse me. So the way we defined native, or at least when, for example, I presented the methane data, the pivotal management feature we were trying to isolate is whether they had a history of cultivation. Because the history of cultivation is the catastrophic disturbance in the past that alters the functionality of that system. But if you look across the suite of grasslands that are still never cultivated, for example, you still find a wide range of footprints of exotic species, and it really depends on rainfall, grazing history, and factors like that. So
Okay.
it's a fuzzy definition. That's what
yes. Yeah, it's not easy. And another attendee is wondering, or says, with drought in Southwest Saskatchewan the last number of years, do you think grasslands have been a source or sink for carbon during these drought years, even with grazing management?
So because the penultimate input of carbon is photosynthesis, if you have significant moisture limitations, you're going to have reduced plant growth. And as soon as you have reduced plant growth, that means you have reduced carbon input into the soil, both in the form of litter above ground, but also root mass. You're going to have less root production and therefore less carbon fixation. So by and large, generally, anytime you reduce the amount of plant production, you're going to reduce carbon uptake.
Okay.
So in all likelihood, they are probably becoming a source of carbon rather than a sink, unfortunately.
Okay. Sounds like you've got a bad cough there.
I got, well, teaching this morning, and so I have this frog in my throat, but we'll soldier on, no problem.
Okay. And a listener named Pam says, great presentation. What are your thoughts on annual cover crops and their species diversity and what they may or may not attribute to soil carbon?
I think anytime you can add plant diversity, I think that's a good thing. So if you are using, so there's simple annual cover crops. For example, if you are, planting oats or barley, that's not really much different than our cereal systems. But if you're planting these annual cover crops that are comprised of the ones I'm familiar with up here, for example, radish and turnip and hairy vetch, and together with a whole bunch of different plant species, that's generally a good thing for many different reasons, because you're adding a lot more biomass. You're going to get complementarity between plants in using more of the rhizosphere, so the below ground root profile more effectively. You're going to get more photosynthesis because the plants are supporting each other. The hairy vetches fixing nitrogen and so on. So that is a good thing in general. The one caveat I would point out that annuals, because of their life cycle, they produce most of their biomass above ground, not below ground. And this is the fundamental difference between any annual production system and a perennial production system. So when you're walking across a perennial grassland, most of the biomass is below your feet. It's in the ground in the form of roots. So we know, for example, from southern Saskatchewan, the work that Copeland did, Robert Copeland did years ago, that 80 to 90% of the biomass in those grasslands is below ground. You're only looking at the tip of the iceberg when you're looking at the shoot mass that's standing up above ground. So while annual cover crops are good in one sense if they involve lots of plant diversity, we still have to keep in mind that most of the biomass is being produced above ground, not below ground. And if we can get more biomass below ground, like we have in our perennial systems, that's when we're truly moving the soil towards greater soil carbon and sequestration.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. I know we're tight for time here. Is it okay if I ask you two more questions?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So Hillary's wondering, was AMP predominantly done on tame or modified rangeland? It seems like you're advocating for use of tame species for carbon storage instead of maintaining native grasslands.
So that is a very good question. So when we set up our AMP study, we recruited AMP producers through all kinds of different outlets, so grazing workshops and things like that. So it was almost like a self-recruitment from the ranchers themselves. We did have some AMP producers that are grazing native grasslands, but I will be the first one to admit that the majority of our AMP producers were operating in areas of higher rainfall, first of all. So whether it be the foothills of Alberta, central Saskatchewan, central Alberta, the boreal transition, and even into Manitoba. So by and large, while yes, it's true that study, we were probably looking at pastures that had some cultivation history and therefore were tame pastures. Whether the same results apply between native and tame, I want to be really careful here, because while yes, we did have some AMP producers that were grazing and using the system very successfully in some of the drier environments, for example, in the mixed grass prairie, by and large, I think most AMP production systems are in use in higher rainfall areas. My personal thinking is the reason for that is because AMP systems are designed to align the removal or offtake of biomass in very close concert with the rapid growth rate of pastures and also manage the regrowth of those pastures. And many of our tame seeded pastures tend to be both very explosive in their growth in the early spring and summer, but also be comprised of highly grazing tolerant plants that once you give them an initial grazing period in the spring and early summer, they tend to regrow very effectively. And that will only happen in higher rainfall environments. So I appreciate where that question is coming from. And if the question is, does AMP grazing work equally well on, in areas that are dominated by native? Yes, it does. But I think it's tied more so to rainfall rather than whether they're native or not. And so we do need more research in that area to try to further tease that out, because I have lots of hypotheses on how this might work.
Okay, that sounds very interesting. Well, when you figure it out, you'll have to come back and do another presentation for
Okay.
us. And our final question from Ross. Excellent presentation. Thank you. Grasslands look to be a great soil carbon story as a land use choice. How can we have this message amplified across the country and to policy discussions?
Yeah, and that's, I 100% agree with that. It's a good news story with the caveat that light to moderate grazing. So, when you look at the impact of different grazing management practices, excessive stocking is excessive stocking. And so as long as we're avoiding heavy, very heavy stocking rates, and we have the stocking rates in line with what the vegetation can handle, particularly for the time of year, whether it's spring or summer, or for the grazing tolerance of the vegetation, which again might differ between native and tame, it is a good news story as long as we stick to those low to moderate stocking rates. So I totally agree with Ross's comment. This is a very good news story, not just the carbon storage, but also the methane sinking and the fact that the greenhouse gas dynamics within these grasslands suggest that well-managed grasslands can be a very significant sink of methane that will counteract not all, but at least a portion of the enteric rumen fermentation and methane production from cows, just what's going on in the rumen. So we need to get that message out more. I do as many webinars as I can. I do as many podcasts as I can, media interviews as I can to get this out. But the bottom line is that I think it's really important for the public, because since they're the consumers ultimately of the product, that they can shape the industry and where beef is produced by an understanding of this, if that's how they choose to spend their money. So I think that's an intriguing possibility. And on the policy side, I think the challenge that we're facing is that ranchers have been providing many of these ecosystem services, including carbon storage, including wildlife habitat, species at risk habitat, water purification, flood mitigation. A lot of these services have been provided by grass farmers and ranchers for decades, and they've never been paid for it in the past. So I think governments are often very reluctant to start to pay for something that they've already been getting for free. But we're rapidly getting to the point that if we don't start incentivizing producers to maintain and enhance these services, these lands will be at risk of land use change. And land use change is usually, if it's not suburban sprawl or urban industrial sprawl, it's land use conversion to crop agriculture. And we are seeing that in Alberta, and I'm sure Saskatchewan and Manitoba are still experiencing that. So that's the biggest threat in my opinion.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today, but thank you so much. And I know this is your third time that you've been on here, and we really, really appreciate it. And we had a great turnout today, and there's lots more questions there. But I just want to reiterate how many people have written in to say thank you and how much they enjoyed the webinar. So with that, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on again.
Thank you, and I appreciate the invite, and have a great day.
Yes, thank you. To all of our attendees, thanks for catching it. Be sure to check out tomorrow's webinar. And if you missed anything today, we'll have the recording available on YouTube in the near future. So with that, thanks so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.